Let's take a minute and just look at this piece. This is by Bach. Ich will dir mein Herz schenken, which means I want to give you my heart. It's from St. Matthew Passion. What this does is it gives us a context for a sequence. It allows us to see its role within a larger phrase. So let's take a minute and just look at it. I want to start with motives. And so at the beginning, you expect the beginning to present the main materials. And usually in a more contrapuntal thing like this, you expect some imitation, although it could be that it's just presented in one voice. Imitation means that you presented it in one voice, the motive in one, and then right after it in another. So it involves multiple voices. It's a little hard to see the imitation here, but if you listen to the recording, you'll hear that this idea here is imitated exactly by another instrument. So that is some imitation involved. You also get repetition of the motive up a third, or maybe I should say it's sequenced. It's sequenced up a third here. Let me bracket those so that you get one statement and another. I'm tempted to go to the next downbeat, and that would be fine too. And we can say if we're going to call that X, then these are replicas of it, one at a new pitch level. As we move on, you see that you don't get exactly that, but you are going to get some neighbors. So let me put a little mark here and just make it a little N there to show that there's a neighbor pattern that's important to X. It's the first three notes of that X motive. That's going to come back a bunch of times. One of them is here, and again here. And then there's one there too. Now here you can see you're getting that opening motive again to there. So we've heard da 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 dee da dum, and now we're hearing da 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 dum, which is just like that, just down a third. So I can include that X within a larger chunk of music. I mean, I can include the N within X there again. It's sort of restored right toward the end. The cadence comes here, so this is the end point, the very end of that phrase. Okay, so looking back over this, let me put ends on these before I go on. Okay, so at the beginning we get motive presented to us in imitation and also through sequencing of it up. And we expect that to happen over top of a tonic that's being elaborated or established in some way. And that is what's going to happen here. We're in G, and here's our one chord. You've got this arpeggiation in the bass, so you could view this all as one with some inversions going on. And I won't even bother with all those inversions. You're basically hanging on to tonic until here. And that's a 4 chord. Okay, so that's our beginning. We establish our tonic. There is a little dominant in here, going right back to tonic. And I'm de-emphasizing this because it really is not that big of a harmonic change, not that prominent a harmonic change. Then we're going to get back to our tonic again here. Now it's a plagal motion back to tonic. Now I want you to recognize a sequence that occurs, but this is a tricky one because it actually, the pattern spans bar lines, it straddles bar lines, and that makes it a little bit harder to recognize. Let's see, where does it start? I've got the neighbor pattern, I've got it again, I've got it a third time. Each time we're moving down a third, but that's part of a larger pattern. So I want to try and grab as many notes as I can and include them. I'm going to start right here. And here's a pattern. Let me box them. And it goes right up to here. Now you see what I mean about straddling bar lines? This tied chord, these notes that are tied across the bar line here, happen again right here, and again there's the holding over, and then the neighbor things follow. So this is a good match. These two notes fit. I can't go back any further because there's nothing like this big leap that gets you into this statement. There's nothing like that over here. This is by step. So I can't go back any further. That's got to be my starting point. N is right in the middle of it, and then there's this incomplete neighbor going on over here to finish out that idea. Okay, so here, neighbor, incomplete neighbor, and we're done with that statement. New statement starts here. Oops, I wanted to box the whole business, didn't I? Let me do that. Here we go. Scratch that. And one more statement begins right there. And it's going to go through the neighbor, but then it sort of fizzles here. So I need to do kind of a dash line to show that, you know what, it doesn't really complete that statement. It looks like you're about to do it a third time, but you don't get it complete. Okay, so now that we have the beginning, our establishing our tonic, moving through the dominant and through a 4-chord right back to that one. Once we're done with that and we're into the sequence, we're in the middle. So this is the beginning portion of the phrase. Here's the middle portion. And then we get the ending where the cadence happens. Where you draw this line, I'm not so worried about. I guess you could put it in here somewhere where this starts to fizzle, where the sequence starts to end. You could move it later too, but when the motive, X, and the neighbor idea are all gone, we call that liquidation, and that's a sign of ending. So here's our ending, and it involves the disappearance of elements of our main idea, X and N, this neighbor motive. They're gone. That's called liquidation. And we get a pattern that could happen in just about any piece you like. Alright, let's get into some more detail on the middle now. The sequence that we've identified, we know where the elements are, but we don't really have a label on it. The first part of our label always tells us how we get from point A to point B, how we get from statement to statement. And this goes, as we've said, down a third. Now, generally I'm happy to just have the shorthand label. You could do the root motion too and include that as a longhand label. This one, let's do both so that you can see how both work. Let's talk about chords a little bit so you can see the root motion. What are the roots? Now you expect 2 roots per statement. And this one is a little tricky because you don't get the chordal third until here. See that F sharp? D, F sharp, A, C. You need that to complete the chord. Now what that means is that the chord change, as I've marked up here, new chords begin here and here. The chord change does not happen until the 2nd eighth note of that measure. That's a little odd. In other words, the harmonic rhythm is syncopated here. It does not change on the strong beat, it's changing on weak locations in the measure. We're in the key of G, so D, F sharp, A, C is 5/7, and it finds its resolution here with a 1 chord. These are embellishing, and you're right back to 1 here. So this is all a 1 chord. Now notice, we said we expect 2 chords, and we've got them. We've got a 5/7 and a 1 in there. Now I don't really need to know what status they have in the key, and so I'm going to abandon that for just a minute and just look at root motion. D moves to G. So these are just roots. Now let's look here. It should all be down a third, and so yes, sure enough, instead of D, we've got B. And then a change here, down a third from G. E, we've got E as root. That's an E minor chord. E is our root. That continues on to the end of that statement. Our third statement, which doesn't really come to fruition, starts with a G chord and then goes to C here. Okay, now something should catch your eye here. Use your visual cues. You have some accidentals. This is an important one. Remember, this is our root and then third, so similarly here, that's our root B, and the D sharp is a third. This accidental should cue off some thoughts in your mind. It's raised, so it's probably a leading tone. Well, yeah, that makes sense. We're moving to E. We're tonicizing E. This is a chromatic sequence. Look how it continues. You've got some accidentals here. Why is there an F natural? Now the D is just a cautionary thing. Well, it actually undoes the D sharps that came before, but it's part of this, what the signature would give you. You're going to get a D in this key. So the important note for our purposes is the F natural, because that is outside the key. We should have an F sharp, and we're getting an F natural. Well, why is it lowered? We expect chordal sevenths to get lowered, and that's what's happening here. So this is really a G7, G, B, D, F. Again, we're providing a dominant for the next chord. This is a chromatic sequence, called chromatic because it goes outside the key, and the way this one moves outside the key is it just provides secondary dominants. These are applied 5/7 chords every other chord. The shorthand for that is just to say descending thirds with applied 5/7. Now the longhand, all it adds to that label is it adds the root motion. So let's write it again, the label once more, and now we'll get to the details of how you move from root to root. So we are moving up a fourth, and then we're moving from G to B. You could think of that as down a sixth or up a third. Well, that looks a little odd. Normally the way we do it, that's fine, but to make it look a little bit more like what we're used to, oops, I should have written a sixth there. I'm jumping the gun here. We usually don't use a big 6, but we use the 3 instead, just by convention. So while they're both right, this looks more familiar. We always have to say when they're applied or secondary dominants. There we go. So you could, I'm going to scratch this. You could either write descending thirds with applied 5/7, or if I ask for a complete label, give me the root motion too. Descending thirds, and you do that by down 5, up 3 with applied 5/7. Alright, so thus far we've said here's the beginning, we're presenting a main motive, and we are, and especially that neighbor motive, which is going to come back in the sequence. And we're also establishing our key by moving from 1 to 5 and back again. And in this case, we're also involving a 4 chord. Plagal motion back. Then in the middle, now that we've sort of solidified our home base, we know that we're in G. The sequence then can move us and create a sense of forward drive, momentum pushing through the phrase. That's accomplished by the sequence. This is a little more compelling than some because you've got this resolution required for each one of those secondary dominants, and that has a strong pull. Alright, then we get to the ending, and when you get there, you can't just rely on this label, the sequence label, to tell you how things are working. You have to switch back to the phrase model, in other words, harmonic functions. Sequences are driven by intervals. The cadence depends on harmonic function, resolution. And so let's take a moment and just see how this works. I really encourage you to figure out where you're going before you get into the details, and that's really important here. I often will look at the beginning and say, okay, here's where I am. I know I'm in G, but then I'll jump right across and skip over a bunch of things and get to the ending, because if you have a bunch of accidentals, you might be doing secondary dominant after secondary dominant, not realizing that in the end you're going to modulate there anywhere. You're going to modulate anyway. So then you have to go back and get rid of all those secondary dominants and say, actually those are 5 in the new key. So you can just eliminate all that second guessing and having to erase things by figuring out where you're going before you even start. Here you can see it goes 5-1, and there's the octave there. So that 5-1 motion and the D up top say PAC, but in a new key, in D. Recognizing that you're in D, you know you've got to modulate, and you've got to use a pivot chord somewhere to get there. Sometimes the sequence does that job, but in this case we need a pivot chord because there's no sense that we're in a new key here. We've tonicized G, we've tonicized D minor, we've tonicized C major. Those are all within the key. So the sequence doesn't do it. We need a pivot to transition us, pivot chord to transition us into the new key. Alright, what to do when you're modulating? Look for the first accidental, or barring that, the first dominant in the new key. We're in D, the dominant would be A, and a leading tone, that's the most important part of it, is the C sharp. There it is, but there it is again, and then no more up in front of it. So here is the first appearance of our new leading tone, and we want to pivot just in front of it. I'm going to try to do this, in other words. Give this chord a couple different labels. One for the first key, one for the second. Alright, I'm going to pick up with this chord, since that's kind of where the sequence deposits us. That's 4 in G, and then a 2. There's a 7th added late, I can show that there. And then 5, again in the first key. 7th added a late, and then the tonic. There's our G, B, and D. Alright, now will that work as a pivot? In D, G is scale degree 4, and a major triad on 4 makes perfect sense. 4 is major in a major key, so that will work as a pivot. So G major works as tonic in G and as 4 in the new key, D major. We have a pivot, hooray! So we're ready to move on. Now that leading tone says to me dominant, and so I want to find out if it's D dominant or if it's a substitute, like 7. So we've got A, C sharp, E, and a G. Well, A is the root, that's 5 in the new key. It's inverted though, so A is not in the bass, but G is, the chordal 7ths. That produces 5, 4, 2. We know it's got to resolve. And this isn't really a chord, is it? There's no third in there, so I'm going to take that as passing on down. And then a new chord here, A, C sharp, E, that's our dominant, into our tonic. B, A, C, and when you label cadences and it's in a new key, remember to say so. It's a PAC in 5 or in D. Okay, so this really has helped us review a couple things. One of them is this basic idea that you have in a phrase beginnings that present a motive and that solidify your tonic. Then you have middles that kind of cut loose from the moorings of your key, and produce a forward momentum in the music. Sequences are the thing that do that. Sequences involve motivic content and they involve the harmonic motion as well. So it really encompasses both things. And then as we approach the end, there's liquidation, where those motives disappear and we're left with generic kinds of gestures that you could find in lots of different pieces. And also in terms of harmony now, we have the phrase model kicking in. In other words, we have harmonic function coming to bear once again to create the sense of cadence. 3 distinct parts of a phrase and different jobs going on motivically and harmonically in each location. That's one thing we see here. We also get to review sequences while we're at it and identify those. Well, identify this one sequence. And then at the end here we had a pivot chord modulation, and that's handy to be able to resolve, to review as well, because 2 main topics that we've been covering are modulation, sequences, and then how those sequences play out in various contexts, like this Baroque style here in the music of Bach.